So, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do now is concentrate on the DRC. So we're going to stay in this particular area, this particular part of the industry. And we're going to concentrate on something that Marie-Chantal was talking about, which is the ASMs, the artisanal mines. You'll also know that the 2024 OECD FORUM on Responsible Mineral chains takes place in less than a fortnight in Paris. So what we're going to do now is see what has been achieved so far and indeed what needs to be done as well. So taking a whole chain approach to this one, and we're going to try and bring all stakeholders to this conversation. It's going to be moderated by Susannah McLaren, who's the head of responsible sourcing and sustainability at the Cobalt Institute. But I'm delighted to say that we have an opening presentation now from Professor Raphaël Matamba, coordinator of the CTCPM at the Ministry of Mines. Professor, if you'd like to come and join us, thank you.
Mesdames et messieurs, représentants de l'industrie, marché, utilisateurs du cobalt, membres de l'organisation non gouvernementale, décideurs politiques et opérateurs des médias, en vos titres et qualités respectifs. Avant d'entrer dans le vif de mon propos de ce jour, j'ai le privilège de représenter Son Excellence Madame Antoinette Samba Kalambaye, ministre des Mines de la République démocratique du Congo, qui malheureusement ne pourra pas être parmi nous aujourd'hui. Il y a exactement une année que nous étions réunis pour parler du cobalt dans le monde et de la sécurisation de l'approvisionnement de ce métal critique et fortement utile dans les solutions de la transition énergétique. À cette occasion, la République démocratique du Congo, qui demeure le pourvoyeur mondial par excellence de cette commodité, avait dressé un panorama assez explicite des progrès et efforts qu'elle déploie et initiatives qu'elle a entreprises pour mettre à la disposition du monde du cobalt. À l'occasion, la RDC avait affirmé son engagement ferme de juguler les défis inhérents à son secteur minier et plus particulièrement à la partie artisanale qui, sans doute, demeure une source importante de production du cobalt dans le monde. En 2023, le marché du cobalt a enregistré un excédent historique avec environ 12 500 tonnes, soit une progression significative par rapport à l'année 2022. Les statistiques en notre possession indiquent que le cobalt d'origine artisanale contribue pour 10 à 20% de l'offre nationale de cette ressource au marché international, ce qui en fait le second contributeur mondial juste avant l'Indonésie. En fait, la demande de cobalt pour l'année 2023 s'est chiffrée à 213 000 tonnes. Il s'agit là d'une augmentation de 15% par rapport à l'an 2022 et cette tendance dure déjà. L'on peut noter tout de même que la demande en cobalt pour la fabrication des batteries des véhicules électriques a doublé au cours des 3 dernières années. Considérant l'importance du secteur artisanal dans la production du cobalt, le gouvernement congolais, avec l'assistance de ses partenaires techniques et financiers, a élaboré diverses initiatives et entrepris des actions en vue d'aboutir à la commercialisation d'un cobalt propre, conforme aux attentes du marché international. Ainsi, afin de répondre à ces besoins mondiaux cruciaux de contrôler la production, la transformation et la commercialisation, particulièrement du cobalt d'origine artisanale en République démocratique du Congo, et assurer ainsi un approvisionnement responsable, les initiatives suivantes de formalisation de l'exploitation minière artisanale ont été menées. 1. La création des zones d'exploitation artisanale viables. La non-attractivité des zones dédiées à l'exploitation artisanale constitue l'une des principales causes de l'invasion des périmètres miniers concédés ou de la création de facto des sites miniers dits tolérés. Pour pallier cette situation, la création des zones d'exploitation artisanale ZEA constitue une solution. En effet, à la suite des procédures de déchéance de certains titres des droits miniers défaillants, une liste de sites miniers susceptibles d'être institués en ZEA supposés viables et contenant des occurrences en minerais cupro-cobaltifères, aurifères et stanifères a été établie. La dite liste a été confrontée aux données cadastrales avant d'être soumise à l'examen du service géologique national de la RDC en vue de garantir la régularité et la viabilité du processus de leur érection en zone d'exploitation artisanale. 2. Nous avons la mise en place d'un système harmonisé de traçabilité des minéraux de la RDC. Sur ce point, les services du ministère des Mines sont à pied d'œuvre pour la mise en place d'un système national de traçabilité des minéraux intégrant l'initiative de traçabilité du cobalt. L'autre point, c'est la signature de plusieurs arrêtés visant à réglementer cette formalisation, dont notamment l'arrêté ministériel fixant les procédures de détermination des statuts des sites des filières aurifères stanifères, cupro-cobaltifères et des pierres de couleur en RDC, qui intègre la notion des statuts bleus tels que prévus par le mécanisme régional de certification et remédier ainsi à la rareté d'émission des qualifications des sites miniers d'exploitation artisanale. L'arrêté ministériel portant réglementation des activités du suivi de la traçabilité des substances minérales est mise en place d'une commission ad hoc. Également, l'actualisation de l'arrêté ministériel portant mise en œuvre du mécanisme régional de certification de la conférence internationale des régions des Grands Lacs en République démocratique du Congo. Nous avons eu également à faire l'opérationnalisation de l'inspection générale de mines, l'intégration de l'artisanat minier dans le périmètre de la déclaration de l'initiative pour la transparence dans les substances extractives ITA. Cela fait maintenant que chaque trimestre, l'ITA publie le rapport sur les 3 TG, les 2C, donc cobalt, cuivre, diamant, qui provient de la filière artisanale. Il y a eu également la viabilisation des zones d'exploitation artisanale en partenaire avec le BGR dans les provinces du Haut-Katanga et du Lualaba. Nous avons fait également la mise en place du modèle de l'étude d'impact environnemental adapté à l'exploitation minière artisanale sous financement du BGR. L'élaboration en cours d'un cadre normatif 100% congolais sur l'exploitation minière artisanale du cobalt en RDC. Alors, dans la même lancée, les efforts remarquables continuent d'être fournis en vue de parachever l'opérationnalisation du centre de négoce de Moussompo dans la province du Lualaba. Il faut rappeler ici que ce centre a pour mission contrôler et garantir la canalisation des flux de minéraux issus de l'exploitation artisanale du cobalt à l'EGC. Rappelons également que ce centre de négoce, sous l'encadrement des services de l'État attitrés, contribue non seulement à la traçabilité de nos minéraux, mais permet également la vente de produits au prix unique et concurrentiel, bien entendu pour mettre fin à toute spéculation des prix et à l'évasion des produits. Nous avons également en cours la redynamisation de la commission interministérielle chargée du suivi du travail des enfants dans les mines d'exploitation artisanale, qu'on appelle Systema. Notons que cette commission vise à garantir la traçabilité et l'exploitation juste du cobalt artisanal en assainissant tous les circuits par la mise à l'écart de tous les enfants dans les sites miniers. Pour ce faire, nous poursuivons cette collaboration étroite avec nos partenaires techniques et financiers, dont notamment l'Organisation internationale du travail OIT, mais aussi de l'USAID et tant d'autres. Nous avons également le démarrage effectif des activités de l'autorité de régulation et de contrôle de marché des substances minérales stratégiques, ARECOMS, qui parmi ses missions lui reconnues doit entre autres veiller à l'assainissement optimal des chaînes d'approvisionnement et de traçabilité en s'assurant notamment de l'absence d'enfants mineurs, des femmes enceintes et d'autres personnes vulnérables ou non autorisées dans les sites d'extraction et sur toutes les chaînes d'approvisionnement des substances minérales stratégiques. Et en perspective, nous comptons rendre pleinement opérationnel l'EGC, l'entreprise générale de Cobalt, en la dotant des moyens financiers conséquents par la GECAMINE et certains partenaires financiers tels que l'USAID, qui accompagnent déjà l'EGC à travers son projet Africa Trade Investment. 2. Proroger aussi les décrets du 5 novembre 2019 qui portent sauvegarde des activités relatives aux substances minérales stratégiques d'exploitation artisanale, qui, à son article 8, qui limite à 5 ans, soit jusqu'en novembre 2024, en principe, le droit exclusif qu'a l'EGC d'acheter toutes les substances minérales stratégiques d'origine artisanale en République démocratique du Congo, afin de proposer une solution immédiate aux conditions de travail des artisans miniers, ainsi qu'un encadrement en adéquation avec les normes sociales, environnementales et de bonne gouvernance. Nous comptons également élaborer une initiative globale de traçabilité pour l'ensemble de la large palette de nos minéraux, notamment ceux de la filière cupro-cobaltifère. La spécificité de chacun de ces minéraux, avec parfois au sein d'une même filière métallique des variances complexes, rend la tâche très ardue, sinon aléatoire. Nous continuerons donc de développer les initiatives filière par filière pour ensuite dégager des éléments généralisables, susceptibles à terme de conduire à une approche globalisante. Mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et qualités respectifs, je voudrais réitérer l'engagement ferme du ministre de Mines à exploiter tout le potentiel de notre secteur du cobalt, non seulement pour alimenter la croissance de la République démocratique du Congo, mais aussi et surtout le continent africain ainsi que le monde entier. Le cobalt est un composant indispensable des technologies qui alimentent les économies modernes et les industries innovantes. Nous avons la responsabilité de gérer ces précieuses ressources de manière éthique, transparente et durable. Il nous incombe donc de veiller à ce que l'extraction et la fourniture de cobalt dans notre pays respectent la dignité de chaque travailleur, protègent les droits de l'enfant, maintiennent les normes environnementales et contribuent à la prospérité de notre nation. Bref, la République démocratique du Congo n'a aucun intérêt à s'opposer à toutes les propositions ou à entraver toutes les initiatives qui concourent à une exploitation artisanale respectueuse des pratiques ESG. Je vous assure que sous la direction de son Excellence Madame la Ministre des Mines, qui met en œuvre la politique de son Excellence M. Félix Antoine Tshisekedi Tshilombo, président de la République, chef de l'État, nous continuerons à adopter l'application des normes réglementaires et environnementales solides. Nous encourageons également l'approvisionnement responsable et nous nous efforcerons de faire de la RDC un partenaire crédible, fiable et très sollicité dans le commerce mondial du cobalt. Mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et qualités respectifs, il sied tout de même de rappeler ici que le gouvernement congolais condamne et lutte fortement contre les entreprises internationales qui s'approvisionnent en coltan cassitérite et wolframite au Rwanda. Il en ressort clairement que les minéraux extraits dans cette région sont désormais considérés comme des minéraux de conflit, ce qui complique l'approvisionnement responsable tant au niveau national, régional et international et biaise de ces faits le commerce international. Les 10 minéraux prennent la trajectoire de Kichanga vers Bunagana et à partir de Bunagana, les minéraux sortent du pays pour une destination qui est le Rwanda. De plus, il s'est de souligner que la région de Rubaya à l'est de la République démocratique du Congo est maintenant sous contrôle des terroristes du M23. Dès lors, des mesures drastiques sont en train d'être prises en place par le gouvernement congolais pour faire face à cette situation, telle que mener conjointement un plaidoyer avec le ministre des Affaires étrangères au niveau du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies pour solliciter un embargo contre les minéraux 3T congolais vendus à partir du Rwanda. J'invite donc toutes les parties prenantes que vous êtes, et chacun selon sa sphère de compétences, mineurs, chefs d'entreprise, régulateurs et partenaires internationaux, à prendre acte du communiqué officiel de Son Excellence Madame la Ministre des Mines sur cette situation désastreuse de Rubaya. Travaillons ensemble pour créer un secteur du cobalt qui alimente la croissance, préserve les droits de l'homme, protège notre environnement et offre un avenir dont nous pouvons tous être fiers. Le potentiel de la République démocratique du Congo est vaste et la volonté est forte. Ensemble, nous pouvons nous engager sur une voie pavée de croissance économique, enrichie par le progrès social et illuminée par la gestion de l'environnement. Au nom de Son Excellence Antoinette Samba Kalambaye, ministre des Mines, je vous exprime notre sincère gratitude pour votre implication, tant dans cet important congrès, ainsi c'est votre participation et votre dévouement qui ont dynamisé ces discussions et qui feront avancer l'avenir de notre industrie du cobalt. Que vive le Cobalt Institute, que vive le secteur cupro-cobaltifère de la République démocratique du Congo, que vive la République démocratique du Congo. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matamba, for outlining the DRC government's commitment to responsible cobalt, not just from the artisanal sector, but more holistically. And also I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Congolese government for sending such an extensive delegation to represent and engage in such important discussions. So on that, we'll move to our session, which is session 3, DRC Stocktaking Collaborative Efforts on ASM Cobalt. And we're honored that the OECD, also present today, has allowed us to label this important panel as in preparation for the 17th edition of the OECD Forum on Responsible Minerals Supply Chains, taking place at the OECD headquarters in Paris next week, which I know several delegates in the audience will also be attending. And a recording will also be made available to the delegates there to continue the conversation. So I'm your moderator for this afternoon. I have the privilege of being joined by a distinguished and multi-stakeholder panel of speakers this afternoon who are undoubtedly best placed to engage in the subject matter of this session. And just before I introduce them, I'd like to make a few comments to frame the discussion from the Cobalt Institute's perspective. So our latest cobalt market report, which many of you might already have started to get stuck into, which was launched this morning, states that ASM has been an important contributor to cobalt supply in the past. The US Geological Survey estimated that in 2020, artisanal cobalt supply was comparable to 10% of DRC supply, about 7 to 8% of global cobalt production. And for those of you who want to get stuck into the numbers, I'd credit Andrew Gully, from the USGS, who's with us today, who spent a lot of time coming up with those figures and triangulating the data in a very robust way. However, with global mine supply doubling since 2017 and up more than 50% since 2021, ASM supply has actually lost market share. ASM volumes have been impacted further by weak cobalt prices, meaning that the number of artisanal cobalt miners in the DRC dwindled through 2022 and 2023, from the last peak in late 2021 to early 2022. This now means that the impact of the ASM sector on the wider cobalt market is more muted. But despite the fact that the industrial sector from the DRC and globally far outweighs the artisanal sector in terms of cobalt production, the ASM sector in the DRC still remains an important source of livelihood for numerous people and their families who lack alternatives. And the well-documented issues associated with the ASM cobalt, including unsafe working practices, gender discrimination, unfair trading practices, corruption, environmental degradation, and in some instances child labor, continue to receive global attention and concern. The Cobalt Institute has convened today's session because as the Global Industry Association for the Cobalt Value Chain, we believe it's important to be a convener to maintain momentum on achieving progress to achieve a safe, sustainable, and responsible ASM cobalt sector. Today's panel will aim to take stock of progress on collaborative efforts to formalize ASM cobalt sector, identify what more is needed to continue to make progress, and offer a US perspective on the ASM cobalt sector. I'd now like to welcome to the stage our distinguished panelists, who will each offer their introductory remarks in the order that I present them, from a Congolese, US, and international perspective. And we're very honored today to have Mr. Éric Kalala, if you'd like to come up and take the stage, a Managing Director for EGC, Mr. Richard Robinson, Senior Advisor for Risk Management Across Cultures, Mr. Assheton Stewart Carter, co-founder and strategic advisor at the Fair Cobalt Alliance. And last but certainly not least, Ms. KaLeigh Long, CEO of Westwin Elements. Closing the session will be Louis Maréchal, senior advisor at the OECD Secretariat, who will offer some reflections on the panel discussion. And I'll take my seat here and try to diligently watch the time, because this is a session that we could have a few days on, and we're trying to condense until 4 o'clock. So starting with Mr. Kalala, I know that you have a presentation that you'd like to make as your opening remarks, much awaited, and I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Il était d'abord important, je ne sais pas si tout le monde est au courant et tout le monde maîtrise le contexte de la RDC. Le contexte de la RDC, effectivement, il y a plusieurs minerais. C'est un pays assez riche, non seulement de sa population, mais aussi de son sous-sol. Mais il est important de faire une bonne communication aussi sur le pays et comment sont étendues ses richesses. Alors, elles sont un peu diverses sur tout le pays. Ici, nous allons parler essentiellement des minerais stratégiques. Au sens de la loi congolaise, il y a 3 minerais stratégiques. Il y a le germanium, le coltan et le cobalt. Et pour bien faire comprendre, en fait, il s'agit... Bon, pour le germanium, il est fait essentiellement de manière industrielle, via une société sœur qui est aussi fille de la Gécamine, STL. Mais sur le coltan et le cobalt, c'est deux régions très différentes. Le cobalt, il s'agit essentiellement du sud, l'ancien Katanga. Et le coltan, il est opéré plutôt dans l'est, justement la zone de la guerre. Donc, je dis cela pour qu'il n'y ait pas un amalgame. Le cobalt, il est miné dans des zones qui ne sont pas des zones de guerre. Donc, le cobalt, à ce niveau-là, est un cobalt propre. Après, sur le coltan, je crois que le professeur Raphaël Matamba a été assez clair aussi sur la problématique du coltan à l'est, qui est tout à fait différente. Donc, le Congo a une responsabilité claire et il en est conscient et il le prend à bras le corps, puisque ces minerais sont très importants dans la transition énergétique. Et sur une planète qui nous appartient à nous tous, nous, Congo, via le gouvernement de la République, nous comptons assumer nos responsabilités pour protéger la planète. Donc nous allons nous focaliser sur la région du Katanga, comme je l'ai dit. Le EGC, pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas, c'est une entreprise publique congolaise, fille de la GECAMINE, qui a reçu la responsabilité, via un monopole d'État, d'exercer la commercialisation des minerais stratégiques d'origine artisanale en RDC. Donc, la volonté ou les objectifs de EGC, c'est d'améliorer les conditions de travail et de rémunération des artisanaux, mais aussi d'améliorer par la formalisation les revenus de l'État. Il s'agit aussi d'assurer une traçabilité efficace du cobalt produit, mais aussi d'améliorer la réputation de la RDC. Comme vous le savez, la production du cobalt est fortement entachée par des problèmes réputationnels. Vous avez compris des différentes discussions qu'il y a eu. 90% du cobalt produit en RDC et du cobalt industriel est généralement produit selon les méthodes les plus avancées et les plus propres au monde. Mais il y a un sujet de réputation qui est entaché par les quelques sujets de droits de l'homme et de travail des enfants et des personnes vulnérables. On ne le dément pas, il existe. Il existe de manière pas aussi franche qu'on le dit, mais le gouvernement de la République a pris la décision, via EGC, d'adresser le problème et de trouver des solutions pour protéger aussi le cobalt au niveau mondial, puisque les attaques se généralisaient sur la commodité. Donc les actions, elles sont diverses, tant sur le travail que sur la traçabilité et sur la production, comme nous l'avons chez EGC. Je vais essayer d'aller très vite, comme le temps est très limité. En tout cas, notre volonté aussi, c'est une volonté de souveraineté économique. Pourquoi? Puisque c'est un minerai qui est essentiellement au Congo. Je pense que le Congo a pris la décision qu'il doit prendre ses responsabilités et que dans ce sens-là, il doit être moteur tant sur la production que sur l'utilisation de ce type de commodité dans son économie. Après, c'est aussi la promotion du contenu local pour pouvoir créer de l'entreprise congolaise, pour créer aussi de la mine congolaise de moyenne taille pour l'avenir, parce que l'entrepreneuriat, c'est vraiment pour nous un modèle de croissance de notre économie. Et au-delà, on voudrait aussi s'assurer que les artisanaux d'aujourd'hui, puisque un artisanal, c'est un savoir-faire, c'est comme les maroquiniers, donc nous voulons que les artisanaux d'aujourd'hui soient demain des petites mines ou des mines de moyenne taille, mais tout à fait responsables. Après, c'est aussi le respect des normes environnementales, puisque la mine d'aujourd'hui, on doit la considérer que c'est dans un pays qui a un avenir, c'est un sous-continent africain qui demain doit continuer à exister, même après la mine. Donc, c'est-à-dire que les règles environnementales doivent être très importantes et très insérées dans le cycle de développement de nos mines. Après, c'est les standards qui sont très importants. Les standards, c'est via le ministère des Mines, via les standards OCDE avec lesquels nous mettons en ligne, mais aussi c'est avec l'implémentation du régulateur qui est ARECOMS, qui va permettre de mieux cerner notre production, de mieux analyser nos statistiques et de s'assurer que celles-ci soient bien respectées dans la production de manière globale. tant sur l'industriel que sur l'artisanal. Donc, la contribution générale de l'entreprise générale du cobalt, elle doit être positive pour les coopératives, puisque nous travaillons via les coopératives avec les artisanaux. Donc, c'est normalement quelque chose de très positif pour l'environnement global, mais c'est quelque chose qui doit être implémenté très rapidement pour régler toutes les problématiques qu'on a précisées. Et le comité actuel de gestion ou le conseil d'administration a été mis en place il y a une année. Et ce qui a été fait depuis, c'était d'abord de revalider avec toutes les parties prenantes les normes et les standards, puisque c'est ça les fondamentaux. Et donc, par rapport à cela, nous avons pu échanger à ce moment-là avec les artisanaux, avec les coopératives, la société civile, les provinces, les partenaires internationaux. Donc nous avions les États-Unis qui étaient représentés, nous avions la France, l'Allemagne, la Chine, puisque pour nous, le Congo, comme depuis sa création, a toujours été un pays ouvert. Nous estimons que nous devons rester ouverts et nous sommes une solution justement pour tout le monde. Et donc à ce titre-là, nous sommes une opportunité de développement et d'affaires pour tous nos partenaires. Il y avait des challenges, c'était par exemple la mise à disposition de zones d'exploitation artisanale minéralisée. Donc ça, nous sommes en train de trouver des solutions. Il y avait aussi, justement via la GECAMINE, qui a mis à disposition des sites par amodiation, mais il y avait aussi des problèmes de qualité et des problèmes légaux que nous avons pu aussi résoudre en trouvant un arsenal ou des solutions juridiques pour éviter ou rester dans totale conformité avec la loi, c'est ce qui est notre must de manière générale. Donc nous avons mis en place un modèle opérationnel, nous avons avec la GECAMINE signé un accord d'amodiation, mais nous sommes aussi en train d'implémenter maintenant une phase pilote. Et donc, en discutant avec les parties prenantes, le leitmotiv que nous avions reçu, c'est que tous maintenant, ils n'attendaient qu'une chose, c'est d'aller au concret. On avait fait assez de discours, il fallait maintenant aller au concret. Et c'est comme ça qu'avec la GECAMINE, nous avons eu des discussions et nous avons pu identifier des sites minéralisés pour pouvoir lancer les sites pilotes. Le processus est en cours, il a été lancé depuis février, donc grâce à la GECAMINE, avec le support du cadastre minier également. Au niveau administratif, comme vous le voyez, on vous a un peu montré ce qui est prévu ou ce qui est en cours. Donc pour l'instant, nous sommes dans des études géologiques sur les sites que nous avons reçus. Et vous voyez, nous essayons d'avancer le plus vite possible, mais nous essayons aussi de rester le plus conforme possible aux règles que nous nous sommes assignées, que le gouvernement de la République nous soit assigné, qui sont les règles générales en total lien avec les règles OCDE. Donc à ce niveau-là, pour l'instant, les études sont en cours, les analyses de sol sont en cours, et donc le mois prochain, nous devrons faire les forages. Et notre objectif, c'est de pouvoir produire d'ici la fin de l'année du cobalt propre, mais du cobalt vert aussi. Et à ce titre-là, on veut que la RDC, en tant que premier producteur de cobalt, soit aussi un pays d'avant-garde sur tout ce qui est minage responsable et durable. Et à ce niveau-là, on pourra venir sans doute l'année prochaine pour vous montrer les résultats en allant vers des réalisations fermes. Donc, les sites que nous avons eus de la GECAMINE sur cette phase pilote il y a 5 carrés miniers, mais essentiellement sur 2 sites, de Tombolo et de Kanunka. Donc, ils sont illustrés là. Et donc là, c'est un peu, j'ai aussi prévu de vous montrer un peu l'état d'évolution. Donc, vous voyez que les analyses sont en cours. Il y a eu plus de 400 prélèvements pour bien... en fait, l'idée, elle est laquelle ? Le minage, pour le faire de manière saine, il faut s'assurer aussi que... c'est vrai que c'est de l'artisanat, mais après l'artisanat, on va rendre les actifs à la GECAMINE. Ça veut dire que le design de la mine doit être fait de manière assez sain pour ne pas empêcher le développement futur d'un projet industriel. Et c'est comme ça qu'il nous faut faire un design bien analysé pour s'assurer que tout se passe au mieux. Donc ça, c'est les phases qui sont en cours. Donc Les prochaines étapes, c'est justement les forages dont je vous parlais, qui vont permettre de faire un design précis de la minéralisation et des différentes couches, qui vont faire une mine saine. Donc là, c'est les forages aussi qui sont les prochaines étapes. Et donc, je pense d'ici juin, nous devrons avoir fini, au cours de cette année, nous devrons avoir fini les forages. Okay. Et enfin, quand on aura fini les forages, justement, on aura une évaluation aussi des réserves de la mine, puisqu'au-delà de toute expérience de conformité, il faut aussi une réalité économique. Et donc là, il faudra qu'on s'assure que les sites pilotes aient une rentabilité ferme. Et à ce niveau-là, sur les réserves et les ressources, on va utiliser aussi un référentiel UNFC pour s'assurer qu'on ait une bonne connaissance de ce qui y a comme dépôt dans nos mines, et ainsi on pourra faire un projet intelligent. Donc, le chemin, comme vous le voyez, il est en cours. C'est des choses que nous mettons en place. C'est pour vous montrer que le gouvernement de la RDC, à travers EGC, à travers la GCAMIN et à travers les différentes parties gouvernementales, donne une impulsion qui est réelle. La GCAMIN a mis à disposition des sites minéralisés qui pouvaient servir à une exploitation économique. Maintenant, elle a pris ses responsabilités dans ce sens. Il y a un financement. On est à l'ordre de plus de 2 millions sur le projet ATI que nous sommes en train de monter avec l'USAID, le Fair Cobalt Alliance et RMI. Nous avons aussi le support du gouvernement allemand via la GIZ et de Cobalt for Development. Cela prouve qu'en fait, nous matérialisons des choses qui, c'est vrai que ça prend du temps, mais d'ici l'année prochaine, nous pourrons venir avec des résultats fermes, et après, nous pourrions faire une extrapolation sur d'abord sur la commodité, mais sur toute l'étendue de la RDC, et après aller aux autres commodités des minerais stratégiques, essentiellement le coltan. Mais on avait un bon exemple avec le cobalt, qui nous permet d'avoir une zone assez stable économiquement, et c'est vrai qu'un des challenges, c'est aussi la pauvreté. C'est pour cela que nous incitons aussi les industriels, c'est vrai que c'est sur un principe de volontariste, de venir participer aussi à cette aventure. C'est une aventure qui, à mon avis, va démontrer quelque chose de positif par rapport à la mine en général et par rapport à son image dans le monde. Mais là aussi, avec la mise en place du régulateur qui est ARECOMS, je crois que nous pourrons aussi, même au niveau de la sortie, même au niveau de l'application des normes, tant au niveau de minage, mais aussi des entités de traitement, nous pourrons aussi mettre une volonté ou des règles plus strictes et un contrôle plus étroit pour s'assurer en fait que le minage se fasse de manière responsable. Donc je voudrais profiter de l'occasion pour remercier aussi l'USAID, le RMI, le FCA et la GIZ pour le support tant technique que financier qui doit arriver, mais en tout cas la volonté d'abord au niveau congolais, c'est de nous-mêmes assumer nos responsabilités et que quel que soit le format, nous serons toujours les premiers responsables de ce que nous faisons pour l'avenir de nos populations.
Mr. Kalala, if I can
ask
you
finishing
to wrap up your remarks.
Oui. Donc l'idée, c'est vraiment que ces phases pilotes puissent s'étendre. Une fois qu'on les aura validées avec toutes les parties prenantes, on pourra étendre ce fonctionnement que nous établissons à toutes les mines de RDC, et vous verrez que le narratif de la RDC pourra changer très vite. Merci.
Thank you very much. And I know that you had the challenge of summing up an immense effort that your government, GCAMIN and EGC have been undertaking. And my reflection, having moderated a panel during the pandemic when the Cobalt Congress was online, is and where we did have the EGC speak, is it's notable what the work that you've done in these few years. And I'd now like to turn to Richard, who has also been working on this agenda very closely with the EGC and others in various capacities. And I wonder if you can offer some reflections, just taking stock of where we are today.
It's a pleasure, and thank you to the Cobalt Institute for asking me to share a few points on progress and challenges in face of us today. And I'd like to expand this a little bit and go back 20 years to the process of 3T formalization, which began 20 years ago in the DRC. And as we are faced with challenges, and I'm speaking today personally, I'm not speaking on behalf of the US government, I support and understand the position that the minister has expressed, and I want to add to that with some specific context. There's been a lot of success and progress. The 3T system of traceability, of validation of sites, and so on, had the elements of traceability in it. As we see today in North Kivu, it is a situation that is not up to fragility and weakness and insecurity. And so the system, to the detriment of the people of North Kivu and the economy of the Congo, is extremely serious. As we look now at Cobalt, let's learn from what we can of what worked and what didn't work in these other minerals. And while I fully support the statement personally, I want to point out that tantalum coltan is also exported from the province of Tanganyika, and it is not affected by these conditions and should not be banned. Just as we now understand that Africa's largest gold mine is in the eastern Congo, Kibali's mine of Barrick gold. So gold, which is a serious ASM risk, is also an extraordinary industrial success. And so in the same environment that creates challenges around coltan, we have the success of Kibali, and also the success of alphamine. 20 years ago, all tin was artisanal, and it carried a huge legacy of conflict financing. 92% of the DRC's exports today are industrial and come from one mine. 6% of the world's clean, conflict-free tin comes from alphamine. So there have been extraordinary successes, and they move in the direction of where we have the capacity to implement the traceability systems for artisanal mining, and where we can encourage investors, good investors, things can improve. So let's not throw out all of what we've learned and accomplished in this time. And in particular, over the last years in the cobalt space, we have achieved a lot in terms of understanding the commitment that's possible across all sectors. I had the opportunity to be asked by FCA, my consulting firm, to look at how could we legally, while we are awaiting more artisanal mining zones, how can we work with title holders, industrial title holders, to determine a legal option for them to use some of their concession for legal artisanal mining, and to use that as a basis for formalization. As MD Kalala explained, Gécamines has now agreed to try this legal approach, which is to take 5 sites and pull them out of their industrial permits and convert them through a lease. In French, the word is amodiation, through a lease, and allow the industrial miners who are in a co-op that's legal and operating legally and certified by as a cooperative company to operate legally. And so it's an opening not to replace artisanal mining zones, because we need those. We need a raft of solutions. This is a way to begin, where we have an industrial cobalt mine that has seeded 5 sites to artisanal miners. And hats off to Gécamines for that commitment. that is remarkable in the world of mining. In addition, Gécamines is contributing to what was announced earlier by the coordinator, EGC with Fair Cobalt Alliance are working with the U.S. Agency for International Development and for financing of this pilot supply chain based on these 5 sites. So we have an opportunity to create a supply chain. And Gécamines is not only seeding their sites, they are contributing liquid cash to the operations of EGC so it can be a partner with the USAID component. So it's money, and it's also letting artisanal miners who behave legally you have access to the ore body. That's a remarkable accomplishment. And so this supply chain will, as the DG said, the MD said, we hope it's operational by the end of 2024, and the steps are being made. It's not the solution alone, because we need more artisanal mining zones. We can't expect every industrial title holder to give up an infinite amount of their concession to artisanal mining. It has to be in the direction of legalization and formalization. Pilot supply chains also, we hear a lot about poverty. We hear a lot about, which is a real issue and a real driver of artisanal mining. Children have to follow their mothers to the artisanal mines. We extraordinarily see that this is the second largest supplier of cobalt in the world. After the DRC industrial sector is the artisanal sector. But we don't often speak about 2 issues. Artisanal mining in any country, South Africa, where I live some of the time, 20% of its gold is mined artisanally by armed groups who live underground for years at a time. So it's not the Congo alone that struggles with what happens when you're poor and you have rich deposits. But behind the drivers of artisanal mining are criminal and political interests who prefer to keep things the way they are. And we need to be more, at times, politically, economically savvy in our assessment so that we bring those people on and give them an opportunity to be part of a formalized and legal sector. And that is one of the fundamental challenges remaining in all artisanal mining, the coltan of the East and the cobalt of the Southeast. But the system that DG Kalala described will allow an entire supply chain to go from the pit to a place of trading where the minerals are traded. It could be at the Musompo Trading Center, and then on to a certified crude refiner. In French, we call it an entité de traitement, for a legal export. To those of you in the room, we hope you're ready in January 2025 to buy clean ASM cobalt and to begin to transform the image of cobalt red to cobalt green.
Richard, if I can move us along.
So just to say, I think the U.S. has, in the beginning phase of 20 years ago, was supporting ESG activity and the social and political risk for investors. Through the conflict mineral phase, supported the development of a system which has to be improved to keep up with the challenges of insecurity. And now that the U.S. wants to be part of looking at the entire critical minerals sector, industrial and artisanal. But with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, and I'm sure everyone could continue to listen to Richard's insights for a long time because he has so much experience to share. And I certainly encourage you to do so in the breaks, when there are breaks, or at the dinner later. One organization that's been around really trying to make headway in this area through a multi-stakeholder approach is the Fair Cobalt Alliance, of which the Cobalt Institute is a member, and very much support their efforts and their dedication to this agenda. Assheton, I think it's been about 4 years since the FCA started to set itself up. Where are we now? I mean, Richard and Éric outlined that you're collaborating in a big effort. So today, in May 2024, where do we find ourselves?
So yes, it's 4 years, and the FCA is a non-profit organisation. We focus on artisanal mining in Lualaba. You know, and Susannah did ask us a question before we joined this, was what's the progress that we've seen? And, you know, I think one of the things that I've seen over the last 4 years is really a shift in how we look in ASM. If I go back 4 years, artisanal mining had its own special risk category. The ASM, the whole sector, was defined as a risk. This is not a healthy attitude to have towards a whole sector. For one reason, when we talk about risk, we should be thinking about those who actually experience that risk, and in this case, it's the men and the females who go down 70 meters and risk their lives and the livelihoods of their families. But quite often when we talk about risk, we talk about corporate risk, which is really about compliance risk and reputation risk. But even if we think about it like that, it's not necessarily a very helpful thing, to do, because when we do talk about compliance and reputation risk, we don't acknowledge the root, the underlying cause of that risk, that reputation risk in the first place, which is association with appalling health and safety conditions at the mine, or with child labor, or with unfair pay. If you exclude artisanal mining from the supply chain, which is what happens if you classify the whole sector as a risk, then people lose their jobs. And it doesn't mean that the risk is going to go away. The risk will stay there. It just means that you'll have to work harder to disassociate yourself with it. Far better is to see how we can actually enable and invest, as Richard was saying, into this sector. So I think the shift that I've seen, and I think the Cobalt Institute and Susannah's work has much to do about this, is the shift in the narrative, almost reaching consensus, I hope, that we realize that we have to look at artisanal miners as men and women who want to make a living for their family, where there are few other alternatives, and for sure they want to minimize the risk to themselves, who would want to put themselves at risk to do that. So our job really is to try and change that perception. So I think that's a positive thing that we've seen. So what is the status? Where are we at the moment with the Fair Cobalt Alliance? I think it's important to point out that the Fair Cobalt Alliance is a guest of the Congolese government, and the Congolese government has laid out very clearly a vision for artisanal mining. And our goal, ultimately, when we measure our success, is to support the government in that goal. And in their manifesto, they set out the ambition to professionalize artisanal mining, to facilitate its passage from artisanal mining to small-scale mining, and for artisanal mining to contribute to the ecosystem of added value in the country, which we heard the Professor talk about earlier today, to be part of that international value chain, just not at the top end. And, you know, collaboration is the way forward, and the MOU between the US, DRC, Zambia is an example of that sort of collaboration. So the Fair Cobalt Alliance, what we've achieved, well, I think one of the things we've achieved, this panel is about collaboration, is we are the first and only multi-stakeholder initiative in the Congo, which is addressing cobalt artisanal mining and the well-being of those men and women directly. This is an achievement in ourselves because, you know, I think behind this panel is the idea that these are complex, multifaceted problems, and that you're not going to solve them with a single point entry. You have to find collaboration. It's hard work to collaborate with others, especially if you're competitors, but the Fair Cobalt Alliance, we feel, has achieved that because we do have the downstream companies like Google and Tesla, and the upstream companies like Glencore and Seymour, and the midstreams like Northvolt who are participating in the FCA to a common end. So there's a common North Star there. In terms of actually what's happening on the ground, incremental progress is being made, for sure. Child labour was one of the first things that raised public awareness about small-scale mining in the DRC, and we've been able to establish with our partners the child labour remediation hubs in the DRC. So we're working with 6 Congolese civil society organizations there, and they advised us, the Congolese CSOs advised us, civil society organizations advised us how really to perceive this in a different way that many international organizations have done by putting the children at the heart of the program. And this means not just rushing in and removing children from the mines, but figuring out what they're going to do next. So we actually have a center where these children stay until they're adults, and we put aside money for multi-years so they can actually be remediated completely and find alternatives in education. And this is fully aligned, and we're very pleased that the DRC government fully acknowledged our process for doing this and endorsed those fully remediated children that we've done. So for this, it's time to scale and replicate what we've done. And we've always set out to build a model that others can replicate it. And in the case of child labour remediation, we're very glad to see that now a large-scale industrial Chinese cobalt mine has been modelling what we've been doing, has actually now signed a contract with our partners to look at child remediation on their site as well. So we feel, the word is spreading. On site as well, this is where the occupational health and safety problems persist, and of course they can be a lot better, and we have to try harder, but we have had some successes. So I don't know how many of you have been to a cobalt mine, but one of the least advantaged groups and most disadvantaged groups is females who work in washing situations where they actually wash the ore, and they come out with these terrible kind of rashes, dermal rashes. So a simple solution there was actually getting them some PPE so they can cover themselves up and not get those, and not be exposed to that polluted water, with the result that about 250 women are now being able to make a living, but not necessarily put themselves at that health which they had before. For those who've been on a mine as well, you know that the first answer to safety is training and signage. So we've now trained over 100 safety captains who reach out to about 400 miners every single week to train them in the basics of health and safety. And that reduces all the incidents which can start small and become big. Again, those who've been on a mine, you'll know what I'm talking about. One of the things we really want to do, but it costs a lot of money, is infrastructure, but we have been able to put roofs on top of a lot of these pits. If you can imagine these pits going down 70 meters, and when the rain comes, the water goes down those pits, putting everybody at risk. Simply by roofing many of those pits, we eliminate that danger as well. So there are things which are happening at these mine sites that we're working on now, the mine site they're working on now, which are actually beginning to improve people's lives as they make a living. Another thing we're trying to do, Susannah, is bring in the supply chain downstream, and this is difficult. I'm sure we'll talk about this. Is it full traceability, and we have the traceability to the exporter explained to us. But if I'm a downstream company, if I'm an OEM, how much effort should I put into tracing cobalt up to the mine? And when I do trace it up to the mine, what do I do when I find out the information? Is that going to help actually improve lives? Better if we can channel that effort into improvements on the mine directly. So we launched last year the Responsible Cobalt Credits, and the Responsible Cobalt Credits, think RECs or carbon offsets, are a way for downstream companies to actually contribute directly into the welfare of small-scale miners on these sites and claim that they are making a difference rather than just avoiding a problem. So to finish, and pass on to the last figure, what now? So we've had these incremental success with these small projects. As we've all heard, the price of cobalt is low, so now we feel is a time to double down, establish these systems and these processes are put in place, so that when cobalt prices rise, which the Cobalt Institute assures us it will, that we'll be ready so that these small-scale miners can take advantage of these things. So you heard from Richard that with the lead of the EGC, we are working with them, with the Responsible Mineral Initiative, with our partners in the FCA, to build this pilot supply chain from artisanal mines in the cobalt. So at the moment, we're in the moment of co-developing that with EGC and the other partners, and hope to have that up and running. So the last kind of thing I'd say is what really needs to happen now, and I think it comes down to the pilot, pace, and participation. So we do need to get this pilot up and running. I feel we're kind of almost there. We just need to get these last few things in place so we can get it over the line, and then we can demonstrate the good news story to some of the people in this room that this actually is possible. And again, to echo what Richard said, Gécamines had done an incredible thing to transfer their sites, 5 of these concessions, to artisanal miners. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can't think of another company which has done that voluntarily in the way that they have done it. And so that's a tremendous thing.
Thank you.
And the pace, we need out the pace and participation. I think you really should get more involved in the FCA, and David and I are here to talk about it when you make up your mind.
Thank you. Thank you for cantering through the last 4 years, and we're out today. And KaLeigh, you've been waiting patiently, and I put you last deliberately because I thought it was great, to have the policy, the government, the multi-stakeholder. But ultimately, this all fails if there isn't an off-taker, if there isn't someone willing to commit. And you're setting up a US nickel and cobalt refinery. I would assume looking for sources of clean cobalt. What would it take for a company such as yourself to feel confident in cobalt more generally, not just in artisanal cobalt, but just in knowing where your cobalt is coming from and in knowing that it's sourced responsibly? What would that mean for Westwin Elements?
Yeah, I stole this from somebody else, but we often say at Westwin that we care about SEG instead of ESG. So we're a very people-first company. And that doesn't mean that we don't consider environmental considerations a priority. We consider people a superior priority. And so I think you and I emailed, I personally feel like the greatest harm and where the outrage should be directed, not just around ASM, but even some of the large-scale mining operation, are the wages. And so a livable wage in the DRC for a family genuinely should, at least in Katanga, should be about $1,000 per month. And a lot of these conventional mining operations, low-skilled workers are struggling to earn $150 per month. So I believe in order to solve problems, you have to prioritize and rank those problems. And I think, personally, if I want to sleep at night and I'm off taking product, I need to know that the profit, the margin is equitably shared. I don't want to be profiting out of a material that somebody else, I don't want to use the word like slaved over, but when you're not being paid a livable wage, it's not equitable. So I probably should say that more professionally, but I know like a huge, and this isn't just in Congo, when we've been looking at off-taking feed out of Turkey, Philippines, I ask, how much do you pay your employees? And how much is the rent That's what I ask. I say, how much do you pay your employees, and how much is it to rent an apartment? And it's not just Congo. Even in Turkey, I'm finding they're not even paying what they make an entire month. Can't even afford to pay for a basic apartment. So traceability, working conditions. I've heard a lot about gender equality. All these things. I just think so much is cured if these workers don't have to worry about how they're going to feed their children, despite working an incredible amount of hours. I will say, for artisanal mining, I really care about this issue. So because I started and founded Westwin Elements, largely inspired by one of my very best friends, who is from Bukavu. All of her brothers were killed by Rwanda militia, her father. And, I know we're talking about cobalt right now, but I just want to express my true sympathies and heart, for, we have issues like in ASM around cobalt, which are different than the issues around artisanal mining in Eastern Congo. But that does need to be addressed. So kind of talking to your point, and that can't be addressed without addressing the Rwanda piece of there. So I'm sorry, I'll stay on topic. But I will say, when I first had introduction to ASM Cobalt, I did have a knee-jerk reaction because I was carrying with it my biases towards what's going on in Eastern Congo. So I do, to highlight progress, I agree, I think, with what everybody said here, is that I'm hearing more, and I'm getting on that bandwagon of, it's at least in Katanga, it is very important that we don't restrict a culture, a lifestyle, and a livelihood by just walking away, though the strategy is totally different in Eastern Congo. So I do think it's important to do what we can to make that ASM Cobalt feed compliant, but we have to start with wages. And that comes down, and I've tried to think of all the solutions. I don't have all the solutions, but I think more consumers need to be asking that question first, and prioritize it. And with a lot of these improvements, in the same way that the IRA has milestones and time periods, we can get to the rest, but we need to show up. We need to show up, 10 years ago. And I think that should be the first priority. Also, from my understanding, there are no Western brokers left to be that actual immediate off-taker of ASM. Cobalt Red obviously did a lot of harm towards probably inspiring anybody to show up. But I think we're all unified in here that there's no virtue, there's nothing virtuous or solving towards washing your hands of a problem. Virtue is showing up in that problem, even if you get dirty yourself. You know what I'm saying? So,
yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're all on the same page on that.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful, and I think we always need to bear in mind who's buying the cobalt and what does it take, whether it's industrial cobalt or artisanal cobalt, what does it take to build that confidence? And I think assuring a living wage as the cobalt industry is a really important effort. We're almost out of time, but I would normally take on the role of closing the session and thinking about what have we heard, what can we take away. But I cheated, and to do that for me, I have invited Louis Maréchal from the OECD, who has been working for a long time on also 3TG and cobalt, and he's just going to close us out with some remarks. Thank you, Louis.
Thanks a lot for inviting us. I'm really delighted to be here and also demonstrate the good relations and cooperations we have with the Cobalt Institute. Indeed, those conversations will be continuing next week. Just wanted to say a couple of things in terms of the progress that we've seen on a number of aspects, challenges as well, and also expand the conversation a bit beyond Cobalt. I'm actually happy that a number of the panelists today already did that on my behalf in a way. So most of you are familiar with the OECD work and its guidance on responsible supply chain of minerals. They date back quite a while. A number of the Congolese colleagues here in the room have been associated to that work from the onset. That's dating back 2010. Just a couple of overarching remarks. It applies to all supply chain of minerals, not just the 3TGs. It applies to all companies in supply chain. It applies to large-scale mining operations as well as to artisanal and small-scale mining operations. We focus through those guidance on risks related to conflict financing, serious abuses of human rights, including child labor, as well as serious economic crimes. Corruption has been brought up a couple of times. We keep on emphasizing how critical it is to tackle corruption risks because we feel this is actually an enabler of all other types of risks, a major enabler of poverty that in turn creates the conditions for artisanal mining in those countries. It's not just limited to Africa, it's taking place in a number of geographies. Just to elaborate a bit on the importance of the OECD guidance at the moment, it's been endorsed and enforced in various extent in about 15 global supply chain of minerals at the moment, enforced either through market requirements, Cobalt in particular, for instance, through the RMI, but as well the London Metal Exchange responsible sourcing requirements, enforced through regulations in the US, in the EU, in a number of other countries. So it's really a conversation that is expanding. Again, not just limited to the 3TG conversation. Going back to what Undersecretary Fernandez highlighted this morning, the ESG expectations of the MSP, if you look at that, there are two international standards that are mentioned, the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. So these are guidelines that actually matter, and the private sector and companies are actually very familiar with that at the moment. So indeed, we've been involved in conversations around ASM for 15 years almost now, dating back to the first embargo in 2010 that was enforced by President Kabila back then. We know this sector quite well, we know the challenges, and we've always been supportive of inclusion of legitimate, as we call it, artisanal mining in global supply chains. And I think that's really something that we keep on emphasizing, and looking back at the achievements in progress around these discussions, around this topic in the past 5 to 10 years, it's very clear that now globally companies are much more familiar with what ASM means and the complexity of this sector than even 5 years ago. I have a vivid recollection of an OECD forum, I think in 2016, that started on in very bad conditions with publication of an op-ed in international media criticizing ASM and calling on everyone to basically just not source ASM. We've made a lot of progress since then, and I'm really happy. And that's really not just because of the OECD, it's because of everyone in the room. It's because of governments taking a different approach to ASM. It's because of mining companies. We've heard about the progress today. It's because also of downstream companies realizing that they just cannot stay away from ASM. And I think that was one of the added value of our report in 2019 that really stressed the interconnection between ASM and LSM supply chains in the DRC. This is obviously not a conversation that's limited to the DRC, not a conversation limited to 3TG or Cobalt. We're seeing now ASM coming into lithium mining in a number of countries. We're also involved in responsible sourcing of mica initiative, which is another resource that has whose demand has increased exponentially because of the transition. It's actually widely used in electric vehicles and batteries. So in general, we can feel sort of encouraged and heartened by the tone of the conversation. This is not to undermine the challenges that are still laying before us, and a number of them were mentioned. There's a lot of very complex political economy going into ASM in many countries, a lot of vested interests, a lot of political interferences. So clearly, in order for those progresses to be sustained, we will need a lot of protracted efforts, support from the entire supply chain and the entire mining ecosystem, looking as well at financiers, banks, international financial institutions. Everyone is needed and all hands on deck to ensure that those positive developments are consolidated in the future. That's not an easy task. I think what has changed dramatically is also the realization that ASM is not a negligible producer. It's true for Cobalt, we've heard today. Very, very impressive figures. It's also increasingly true, as I said, for other mineral resources, and in particular copper. And again, not just in Africa, but in Latin America as well. So this acknowledgement of the importance of this sector, of its complexity, the difference between informal, illegal, and criminal is also a level of nuance that wasn't there several years ago. So we still have a lot of work ahead of us, but again, I feel sort of encouraged by the general trend. So thanks a lot, and we will continue those conversations next week. The plenary sessions are live streamed, so you can connect and follow that remotely. But if you're not there, you'll be missing on about 60 to 70 side meetings that will be taking place throughout the week, a number of which looking at ASM. So if you can, please come along and see you next week in Paris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis. And with that, I'd also, and I just have to say that I've known Louis for a while, and I have to say he doesn't give out compliments lightly, especially rarely says that he finds something sort of promising. So I think that's a really good note to end on. And with that, I'd also like to thank our panelists, Mr. Kalala, Richard, Assheton, and KaLeigh for taking us through where we are today on the artisanal sector and what's more is needed to build confidence in Cobalt. Thank you.